Pay attention to this prison surveillance footage from June 2009. You're looking at a man in an orange jumpsuit, sitting in what appears to be a medical examination chair. But look closer at his face. See those horrific scars? The collapsed eye socket? The melted, disfigured tissue that barely resembles human skin anymore? This is Stephen Devereaux. And what you're seeing isn't the result of a prison fight or an accident. This is what happens when a man survives his own execution, 4 massive electrical surges, 2 clinical deaths, and somehow, impossibly, he lived. But here's what's truly terrifying about this footage. It was taken 4.5 months after he was supposed to be dead, inside a maximum security prison hospital wing. And within 48 hours of this image being captured, Stephen Devereaux would vanish into thin air, beginning the most horrifying killing spree in modern American history. A monster who couldn't be killed. A face so destroyed it became the perfect disguise. And 12 more victims who never stood a chance. You ever think about what makes someone truly evil? Not just bad, not just troubled, but genuinely, irredeemably evil. For most of us, that's just a philosophical question we might ponder late at night. But for the families of Stephen Devereaux's victims, it's a question they've had to live with every single day since 2005. Let me take you back to Portland, Oregon, in the early 2000s. Beautiful city, right? Mountains, coffee culture, that whole Pacific Northwest vibe everyone loves. But between 2005 and 2007, Portland had a shadow hanging over it. Women were disappearing. Not the kind of disappearances that make headlines right away. These were women society had largely forgotten about. Homeless women, sex workers, addicts, the kind of people who could vanish and it might be weeks before anyone even filed a report. Stephen Devereaux was 39 years old when he killed his first victim. To everyone who knew him, he was just this quiet guy who fixed boilers and maintained heating systems in commercial buildings across the city, kept to himself, showed up to work on time, paid his rent. The kind of person you'd pass on the street and forget about 5 seconds later. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. He had access to hundreds of buildings, abandoned warehouses, old office complexes scheduled for demolition, condemned apartment buildings waiting for renovation, and he knew every single one of them like the back of his hand. He knew which ones had been forgotten by the city, which ones nobody checked on anymore, which ones had basements and maintenance tunnels where screams wouldn't carry beyond the walls. His first victim was a woman named Rachel Morrison, 28 years old, struggling with addiction, sleeping rough in downtown Portland. She accepted a ride from Devereaux on a cold February night in 2005. Her body wouldn't be found for another 8 months, hidden in the sub-basement of a derelict textile factory on the east side. But Rachel was just the beginning. Between February 2005 and November 2007, 8 women disappeared from the streets of Portland. 8 women whose lives mattered, whose absences left holes in their families and communities, even if the media didn't always see it that way. Sarah Chen, 34, vanished in May 2005. Her sister reported her missing within 48 hours, but the case went cold almost immediately. Jessica Hartley, 29, disappeared in August of that same year after leaving a crisis center downtown. Then Melissa Rodriguez, 31, in January 2006. The pattern was there, if anyone had been paying attention. But here's the thing about victims society deems less dead. Their cases don't get the same urgency. They don't get the headlines. They don't get the task forces and the press conferences. It wasn't until the 6th disappearance that the Portland Police Department finally connected the dots. Detective Sarah Brennan was the one who saw it first. Young detective, sharp as a tack, and she refused to let these cases gather dust. She started pulling files, mapping locations, building timelines, and what she found made her blood run cold. All 8 women had been seen in the same general area of downtown Portland in the days before they disappeared. All 8 had been struggling with homelessness or addiction. And here's the detail that really caught her attention. Witnesses reported seeing several of them talking to a man in a maintenance uniform near various buildings. Different buildings, different times, but always that same description. White guy, medium build, work clothes, forgettable face. Detective Brennan started looking at every maintenance company that operated in the downtown core. She pulled employee records, cross-referenced work schedules, spent weeks narrowing down the list. And then she found him, Stephen Devereaux. Worked for Northwest Building Services, had access to over 200 commercial properties across the city, and his work log showed him at or near the last known locations of 6 out of 8 victims. But knowing and proving are two different things, aren't they? Brennan needed evidence, and Devereaux wasn't making it easy. He was careful, methodical. He never took women from the same location twice. He varied his timing. He left almost nothing behind. The break came in October 2007, and it came from a place nobody expected, a homeless encampment under the Burnside Bridge. A woman named Teresa Coleman had survived an encounter with Devereaux 3 weeks earlier. She'd gotten away, but she was too scared to come forward because she had outstanding warrants. When she finally worked up the courage to talk to police, her testimony broke the case wide open. Teresa described being offered work cleaning out an old building, said this maintenance guy seemed nice enough, promised cash payment, picked her up in a white van. But when they got to the building, an abandoned cannery on the waterfront, something felt wrong. The way he kept looking at her, the way he locked the entrance door behind them, the way he led her down into the basement where there was no work, no cleaning supplies, just darkness and the smell of mold and something else, something worse. Teresa ran. She fought and she ran, and she got lucky because Devereaux hadn't secured the loading dock exit properly. She made it out, disappeared into the night, and spent the next 3 weeks convinced he was hunting her. When she finally came forward, she gave Detective Brennan everything she needed, a description of the van, the location of the building, and most importantly, a physical description detailed enough for a sketch artist. The warrant came through on November 8, 2007. Portland PD raided Devereaux's apartment at 6 a.m., expecting resistance. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. He answered the door calmly, wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, like he'd been expecting them all along. Didn't resist, didn't run, just stood there with this flat, emotionless expression and said, "I was wondering how long it would take you." The apartment was spotless, too spotless. Every surface cleaned with industrial-grade chemicals. Not a single personal photograph, no mementos, nothing that would indicate a human being actually lived there. But Detective Brennan trusted her gut. She called in forensics, and they tore that place apart molecule by molecule. Luminol revealed blood traces in the bathroom shower, under the sink, in the grout between tiles. Even after Devereaux's obsessive cleaning, microscopic evidence remained. DNA testing would eventually match that blood to 3 of the victims, Sarah Chen, Jessica Hartley, and a woman named Amanda Price, who disappeared in March 2007. But the real horror was in his work van. Devereaux had been meticulous about cleaning it too, but forensic investigators found hair fibers caught in the carpet adhesive under the rear cargo area, fabric threads that matched clothing worn by the victims. And in the wheel well, protected from his cleaning frenzy by layers of road grime, they found a small amount of blood that matched Rachel Morrison, his first victim. The abandoned buildings were next. Based on Devereaux's work logs and Teresa Coleman's testimony, investigators identified 14 properties he'd had recent access to. They searched them one by one, and in those dark, forgotten spaces, they found the unthinkable. The old textile factory where Rachel Morrison's remains had been discovered 8 months earlier. They now knew why. Devereaux had been the sole maintenance contractor for that building since 2004. He had keys. He had time. He had complete privacy. In the basement of a condemned apartment complex on Southeast Morrison Street, they found Sarah Chen and Jessica Hartley, their bodies hidden behind a false wall Devereaux had constructed himself. In a derelict warehouse near the docks, they discovered Melissa Rodriguez and 2 other victims, Amanda Price and Nicole Torres. 8 women, 8 lives stolen, 8 families who'd been living in agonizing uncertainty, and now faced an even more agonizing certainty. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Devereaux's DNA under Nicole Torres's fingernails. She'd fought back hard. His fingerprints on a piece of rope found with Amanda Price's remains. Security camera footage from a convenience store showing him purchasing the exact type of industrial zip ties found at multiple scenes. And then there was his behavior after arrest. Most killers, when they're finally caught, they either break down or lawyer up immediately. Devereaux did neither. He sat in that interrogation room, calm as still water, and when Detective Brennan asked him why, his answer chilled everyone in the building. Because I could, because they were there, and nobody was protecting them, and I wanted to know what it felt like. No remorse, no emotion. Just cold, clinical honesty about murder as curiosity, as experimentation, as something he'd done simply because the opportunity existed. The trial began in March 2008. Devereaux's defense attorney tried to argue mental illness, diminished capacity, anything to avoid the death penalty. But the prosecution had evidence that showed clear premeditation, planning, and consciousness of guilt. The cleaning of the crime scenes, the careful selection of vulnerable victims, the construction of hiding places. This wasn't insanity. This was calculation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all 8 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on kidnapping charges, guilty on sexual assault charges that made even seasoned prosecutors sick to their stomachs when they read the forensic reports. The penalty phase took another week. The families of the victims gave impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Rachel Morrison's mother described waiting by the phone for months, hoping her daughter would call. Sarah Chen's sister talked about the guilt of not searching harder, not pushing police more insistently. Jessica Hartley's teenage son stood up and said he couldn't remember his mother's voice anymore, and that was the thing that haunted him most. The jury came back with their recommendation: death. Judge Margaret Thornton, a 30-year veteran of the bench who'd presided over hundreds of cases, said she'd never seen evidence of such calculated cruelty. She sentenced Stephen Devereaux to death by electric chair, to be carried out at Clearwater State Penitentiary in Southern Oregon. Devereaux showed no reaction, just stood there, hands cuffed behind his back, staring straight ahead like he was watching something the rest of us couldn't see. Death row became his home for the next 9 months. During that time, he filed no appeals, made no statements, refused all interview requests from journalists and true crime writers who wanted to understand the mind of a serial killer. He spent his days reading technical manuals and doing crossword puzzles, according to prison guards who watched him. Polite, quiet, utterly unremarkable. His execution was scheduled for December 14, 2008. You know how people say some things are worse than death? For Stephen Devereaux, death would have been a mercy. What happened instead created something far worse than the man who'd murdered 8 women. It created a monster who literally couldn't die. December 14, 2008, started like any other execution day at Clearwater State Penitentiary. The witnesses arrived, family members of the victims, prosecution attorneys, required media representatives, and the chaplain who'd tried unsuccessfully to counsel Devereaux in his final days. They were led into the observation room at 11:47 p.m., sat in rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor, and waited for justice to be served. Stephen Devereaux was led into the execution chamber at 11:52 p.m. He was 42 years old. He weighed 187 pounds. His last meal had been a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Ordinary, forgettable, just like everything else about him had been before the world learned what he really was. The protocol for electrocution is specific and rehearsed. The condemned is strapped into the chair, arms, legs, chest, all secured with leather restraints. A metal helmet is fitted to the head, with a wet sponge inside to conduct electricity. Electrodes are attached. The warden reads the death warrant one final time. Last words are offered and usually declined. Then the executioner, hidden behind a one-way mirror, delivers the current. 2,000 volts for 30 seconds. That's supposed to be enough to cause immediate unconsciousness and cardiac arrest. Death follows quickly, humanely, or as humanely as executing another human being can ever be. Devereaux's last words were 3 sentences. "You think this ends anything? You think death scares me? Watch what happens next." Nobody understood what he meant. Not until later. The executioner threw the switch at 11:59 p.m. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Stephen Devereaux's body. Witnesses reported seeing his hands grip the armrests so hard the leather creaked. Smoke rose from the metal helmet. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber, a smell several witnesses would later say haunted their nightmares for months. 30 seconds passed. The current stopped. The prison doctor approached to check vital signs and pronounce death. Except Stephen Devereaux's heart was still beating. Weak, irregular, but beating. His chest was still rising and falling. The doctor looked at the warden in confusion. This shouldn't be possible. The voltage had been correct. The procedure had been followed exactly. The warden ordered a second attempt. At 12:04 a.m., December 15, 2008, another 2,000-volt surge was sent through. Devereaux's body, more smoke, more burning. Witnesses in the observation room started shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't how executions were supposed to go. This wasn't clean or quick or humane. Second attempt complete. The doctor checked again. Heartbeat still present. Respiratory function continuing. What the hell was happening? Third attempt, 12:09 a.m. This time they increased the voltage to 2,500. Devereaux's body convulsed violently against the restraints. The lights in the execution chamber flickered. Several witnesses started crying. This wasn't justice anymore. This was torture, unintentional but horrifying all the same. Still alive. The heart monitor showed an erratic rhythm, but it was definitely still registering cardiac activity. Fourth attempt, 12:16 a.m. 2,500 volts for 45 seconds this time. The prison doctor would later testify that he'd never seen anything like what happened to Devereaux's body. The electrical current essentially cooked him from the inside. His face swelled grotesquely. The skin on his left side, where the primary electrode was attached, began to blister and char. His left eye socket, subjected to massive electrical resistance, collapsed partially inward. Tissue around his jaw and cheek literally melted, leaving exposed muscle and bone visible through gaps in the ruined skin. The doctor checked his vitals at 12:18 a.m. and pronounced Stephen Devereaux clinically dead. No heartbeat, no respiration, no pupil response. Dead. The witnesses were led from the observation room. The warden began the paperwork. The time of death was officially recorded as 12:18 a.m., December 15, 2008. Stephen Devereaux, convicted serial killer, executed by electrocution per court order. Except here's where it gets truly bizarre. At 12:27 a.m., while the medical team was preparing the body for transport to the morgue, a nurse noticed something. A twitch in Devereaux's hand. She called the doctor back, thinking it was just post-mortem muscle spasms, common in electrocution cases. But then the heart monitor, which hadn't been disconnected yet, started registering a signal again. Weak, irregular, but definitely a heartbeat. The doctor, a man named Frederick Walsh, who'd been with the prison medical staff for 19 years, later said it was the most terrifying moment of his career. He'd pronounced this man dead 9 minutes ago. He'd checked every vital sign. There had been nothing, and now Stephen Devereaux was somehow, impossibly, alive again. They rushed him to the prison hospital wing immediately, got him on proper monitoring equipment, started IV lines, tried to stabilize him. His heart stopped again at 1:03 a.m. Dr. Walsh pronounced him dead a second time, but at 1:15 a.m. cardiac activity resumed spontaneously, no defibrillation, no CPR. His heart just started beating again on its own, like his body refused to accept death. By dawn, Devereaux was in a coma but stable. His vital signs were all over the place, but he was undeniably alive. And his face, God, His face was destroyed. The electrical burns had done catastrophic damage. His left eye socket had partially collapsed. Severe tissue damage on the left side of his face had left him looking like something from a horror movie. Skin grafts might help eventually, but he'd be disfigured for life. The legal questions started immediately. Could a man be executed twice? The sentence had been death by electrocution, and he'd been electrocuted, 4 times in fact. He'd been pronounced dead. Was the sentence carried out? Or did the fact that he survived mean the state had to try again? Constitutional scholars debated cruel and unusual punishment. Defense attorneys filed emergency motions. The victims' families, already traumatized by watching that horrific botched execution, didn't know what to think. Some wanted him executed again. Others said watching him die and come back had been enough. Let him rot in prison for life instead. Nobody could agree. Judge Margaret Thornton, the same judge who'd sentenced him, ordered a stay of execution pending medical evaluation and legal review. The Oregon Supreme Court would have to decide whether the state could attempt to execute him again. Stephen Devereaux remained in the prison hospital wing, under 24-hour guard, while the legal system tried to figure out what to do with a man who couldn't die. He woke up from the coma on December 22, 2008, 7 days after his failed execution. The medical staff said it was another miracle, though Dr. Walsh preferred the term medical anomaly. Devereaux should have had massive brain damage from the electrical trauma. He should have been a vegetable at best. Instead, he was conscious, oriented, and according to the neurological tests, suffering no cognitive impairment whatsoever. What he did have was catastrophic facial damage and a complete inability to feel physical pain. The electrical current had destroyed pain receptors throughout his body, particularly in his extremities and torso. He could still feel pressure and temperature to some degree, but pain as most people experience it? Gone. The neural pathways that signaled danger through suffering had been burned out of existence. The psychiatric evaluation was even more disturbing. The doctor who assessed Devereaux, a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Linda Morrison, noted that while his cognitive functions were intact, something fundamental had changed in his neurological processing. The emotional affect that was already abnormally flat before the execution was now essentially non-existent. His brain scans showed unusual activity in regions associated with fear response and empathy, or rather, the complete absence of activity in those regions. Whatever humanity remained in Stephen Devereaux before the execution, Dr. Morrison wrote in her report, the electrical trauma appears to have extinguished it entirely. We are left with a functioning intellect devoid of any emotional or ethical constraints, combined with a body that cannot feel pain, and therefore has lost one of the primary biological deterrents to violence. Prison officials took Dr. Morrison's warning seriously. Devereaux was kept in maximum security medical isolation. His cell was monitored 24/7 by cameras. Guards checked on him every 15 minutes. 2 officers were required for any movement, even just going to the bathroom. Restraints were mandatory anytime he left his cell. For 4.5 months, this protocol held. Devereaux was the perfect prisoner. Compliant, quiet, cooperative with medical treatments. He never complained about the disfigurement, never asked about the legal proceedings. He read books, mostly medical texts and anatomy guides that the prison library provided, ate every meal without incident, slept on schedule. Looking back, the prison psychologist would later realize that Devereaux had been studying the patterns, learning the guard rotations, memorizing the protocols, waiting for the one moment of complacency that would give him his chance. That moment came on May 2nd, 2009. A new guard, 3rd week on the job, was assigned to the medical wing. Standard procedure required 2 guards for Devereaux's morning medical check, but there'd been a flu outbreak among the staff, and they were running short. The supervising officer decided 1 guard would be okay for a simple check in the medical examination room, especially since Devereaux would be restrained in the examination chair the entire time. The examination room where that surveillance photo was taken, the one from the pre-intro, That's where Stephen Devereaux sat at 9:47 a.m. on May 2nd, 2009, his ruined face clearly visible, restrained in the medical chair while a nurse checked his vital signs and a single guard stood by the door. The guard's name was Marcus Webb, 24 years old, trying to work his way through college. Good kid, did everything by the book. Wasn't his fault that the book hadn't been written for someone like Devereaux. Here's what investigators pieced together later. Devereaux had been loosening the wrist restraint on his chair for weeks, just tiny amounts each time he sat in it for medical checks. The leather was old, the buckle mechanism worn. Nobody noticed that the restraint wasn't quite as tight as it should be because Devereaux never tested it, never gave any indication he was planning anything. Until that morning. The nurse, a woman named Sarah Cho, was taking Devereaux's blood pressure when he made his move. In one fluid motion, he slipped his right hand free from the loosened restraint, grabbed the blood pressure cuff, and whipped the metal stethoscope end into guard Webb's throat before the young man could even react. Crushed his larynx. Webb went down, choking, unable to call for help. Nurse Cho tried to run. Devereaux caught her by the hair, slammed her head into the medical tray table hard enough to knock her unconscious. She'd survive with a concussion and PTSD, but she was no longer a threat. Devereaux freed himself from the remaining restraints, took Webb's keys and radio, and walked out of the medical examination room at 9:51 a.m. He had a surgical mask from the supply cabinet. Standard medical equipment, nobody would question seeing it on someone's face. Between the mask and the fact that his face was so horrifically disfigured anyway, nobody could see enough of his features to identify him. He had something else too, a forged medical transfer order that investigators later determined he'd created using a contraband pen and paper he'd been hiding for weeks. The forgery was crude, but good enough to pass a quick glance, especially since he was betting on confusion and the chaos of an understaffed facility. Devereaux walked past the first guard station at 9:54 a.m., showed the transfer papers, mumbled something about Dr. Walsh requesting him in the main medical building. The guard waved him through. Why wouldn't he? Guy was in a surgical mask, had the paperwork, and there was no alert yet because guard Webb was still unconscious in the examination room and wouldn't be found for another 8 minutes. Second guard station at 9:56 a.m. Same story. Transfer papers, surgical mask, confident demeanor. Through he went. Third and final checkpoint at 9:59 a.m., this time at the main administrative entrance. This guard looked at the papers a bit more carefully. Started to ask a question. Devereaux's response was instant and brutal. He drove the pen he'd used for the forgery straight through the guard's eye socket and into his brain. The guard, a 19-year veteran named Thomas Pax, died before he hit the floor. Devereaux took Pax's uniform jacket, walked out the front entrance at 10:02 a.m., and disappeared into the civilian parking lot. He stole a Honda Accord belonging to a prison administrator who was in a meeting, and by the time the alarm was raised at 10:08 a.m., Stephen Devereaux was already 15 miles away. The manhunt began immediately. State police, FBI, U.S. Marshals, everyone mobilized. His photo was everywhere, showing both his pre-execution face and the horrific disfigurement that should have made him impossible to miss. How do you hide when you look like a monster? Turns out you hide in plain sight, because that disfigured face? It was the perfect disguise. Nobody expects a wanted fugitive to look that distinctive. People saw the scars and the ruined eye socket, and they looked away, uncomfortable, assuming he was a burn victim or veteran with war injuries. He wasn't Stephen Devereaux to them. He was just another scarred stranger they didn't want to stare at. The first new victim was found on May 18, 2009, in Sacramento, California. Michelle Davidson, 31, homeless, strangled, and left in an abandoned auto shop. Forensic evidence would later tie her murder directly to Devereaux, his DNA under her fingernails, his fingerprints on the rope. Then a victim in Reno on June 3rd, another in Salt Lake City on June 22nd. He was moving, staying ahead of the manhunt, and he was getting bolder, more violent. If the original 8 murders had been methodical and careful, these new killings were savage, almost frenzied. Dr. Morrison had been right. Whatever neural safeguards remained in Devereaux's brain before the electrocution were gone now. The inability to feel pain meant he fought his victims with reckless abandon, taking injuries that would stop a normal person. Witnesses who encountered him during this period described a man who seemed invulnerable, who laughed when attacked, who absorbed blows and kept coming like something out of a nightmare. A woman in Portland, different from the Portland where he'd originally hunted, survived an attack in August 2009. She described fighting back with a broken bottle, cutting his arm badly enough that she could see bone, and Devereaux just looked at the wound with curiosity before continuing to advance on her. She only escaped because a car pulled up and the headlights spooked him away. Another survivor in Boise stabbed him in the thigh with a screwdriver, said he pulled it out, examined it, then tried to stab her back with it. She got away by diving into a 24-hour diner. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit built a profile of the new Devereaux. He was no longer the careful, methodical killer who'd hidden bodies and cleaned crime scenes. This version was impulsive, opportunistic, and seemingly unafraid of capture. The pain insensitivity, combined with the neurological damage, had created something beyond a typical serial killer. He had no fear response, no pain to make him cautious, no emotional connection to the consequences of his actions. By December 2009, the body count had reached 17. 8 original victims, 1 prison guard killed during escape, 8 new victims in 5 states. The FBI put him on their 10 most wanted list. The reward for information leading to his capture hit $500,000. And still, he stayed ahead of them. Investigators later discovered he was living among the homeless, moving from city to city via freight trains and hitchhiking. The disfigured face that should have made him memorable actually made him invisible. People in shelters and encampments assumed he was a fellow down on his luck soul and didn't ask questions. The homeless community protects its own, and Devereaux exploited that compassion ruthlessly. Victim number 18 was found in Phoenix in January 2010, number 19 in Albuquerque 3 weeks later, number 20 in Oklahoma City in March. He was working his way east now, and the task force tracking him could predict the general direction, but never pinpoint the specific location in time. The break came from an unexpected source. A former victim who'd survived. Remember Teresa Coleman, the woman whose testimony had helped convict Devereaux the first time? She'd been following the news about his escape and the new murders, and in April 2010, she was in Spokane, Washington, standing in line at a food bank when she saw him. Even with the facial disfigurement, she knew something about the way he stood, the way he moved. She'd looked into his eyes once before in that dark basement, and she'd never forgotten what she saw there, or rather what she didn't see, the emptiness. Teresa didn't panic. She didn't run. She very carefully finished getting her food, walked to a public library, and called the FBI tip line. Gave them the location, the description, everything. The FBI dispatched teams immediately, but they were based in Seattle, 3 hours away. Local Spokane PD got the alert and started a discreet search. By the time federal agents arrived that evening, local officers had spotted Devereaux entering an abandoned meatpacking plant on the industrial outskirts of the city. The building had been condemned for 5 years, scheduled for demolition, but stuck in bureaucratic limbo. Classic Devereaux hunting ground. They didn't go in right away, not this time. The FBI wanted to be smart about this. They evacuated the surrounding area, brought in SWAT teams, set up a perimeter. By midnight, they had the building surrounded with over 60 law enforcement personnel in position. At 1:15 a.m. on April 27, 2010, they breached the building from 3 entry points simultaneously. What happened next became legendary in law enforcement circles as one of the most violent confrontations in modern fugitive capture history. The abandoned meatpacking plant was a maze of industrial equipment, hanging chains, and processing floors slick with years of decay. Perfect environment for an ambush, which is exactly what Devereaux had in mind. SWAT Team Alpha entered through the main loading dock. They'd advanced maybe 30 feet into the building when gunfire erupted from the second-floor catwalks. Devereaux had a stolen pistol, later determined to be taken from a Colorado Springs police officer who'd been murdered in February, a case that hadn't been connected to Devereaux until that moment. Officer James Chen took a round in the shoulder. The team fell back, returned fire, but Devereaux was already moving. He knew this building, had clearly been using it as a base for days at least. He knew every shadow, every hiding spot. Team Bravo entered from the east side, moving through what used to be the refrigeration section. They found her there, victim number 21, a young woman who'd been missing from a Spokane homeless shelter for 3 days. She was still alive, but barely, tied to a meat hook with electrical cord. The team called for medical evacuation immediately, but 2 officers had to stay with the victim, reducing the team's offensive capability. Team Charlie came in through the basement loading tunnel. This was the FBI's hostage rescue team, the best of the best. They moved in tactical formation, night vision active, covering every angle. They were halfway through the basement when Devereaux dropped from an overhead pipe he'd been clinging to and landed directly in the middle of their formation. What happened next, the team leader later said, was like fighting something inhuman. Devereaux had armed himself with a meat hook attached to a chain. He swung it in a wide arc, caught one agent across the face, took him down. Another agent got a clear shot, hit Devereaux center mass. The impact would have dropped most men instantly. Devereaux staggered, looked down at the bullet hole in his chest, and laughed. No pain receptors. He knew he'd been shot, could see the blood, feel the impact. But there was no pain to slow him down, no shock to his system. He kept fighting. Second agent fired, hit him in the left thigh. Devereaux's leg buckled slightly, but he compensated, kept swinging the chain. Third shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him partially around. He dropped the chain, pulled a knife from his belt, and lunged at the nearest agent. Hand-to-hand combat with a man who cannot feel pain is a nightmare scenario. Every technique law enforcement uses relies partially on pain compliance. Joint locks, pressure points, strikes to nerve clusters, none of it worked. The agents had to literally grapple him into submission through pure physical force. It took 6 agents to finally pin him down. Even then, even with 3 gunshot wounds and multiple trauma injuries from the physical struggle, Devereaux was still fighting, still trying to bite, to headbutt, to hurt anyone within reach. They got him cuffed, double cuffs, wrists and ankles, and carried him out of that basement like he was some kind of wild animal. The ambulance was waiting, but the FBI wasn't taking any chances this time. Armed guards surrounded him the entire ride to the hospital. 2 agents literally in the ambulance with him, guns drawn, ready to shoot if he so much as twitched wrong. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize him. The bullet wounds weren't immediately life-threatening, but the blood loss was significant. They got him into surgery, removed the bullets, stitched him up. Through it all, Devereaux never screamed, never showed any sign of pain, just watched the doctors work with that same flat, emotionless expression. By the time he was out of surgery and secured in the hospital's maximum security wing, the full scope of his post-escape crimes was becoming clear. That surveillance footage from the prison medical examination room, the one that showed his disfigured face in that chair, became key evidence in tracking his movements. Investigators compared his appearance in that footage to security cameras from various crime scenes, and despite the surgical mask he'd worn during his escape, they could track him through body language and movement patterns. Video from a Sacramento gas station showed a man with facial scarring matching Devereaux's distinctive injuries, buying supplies the day before Michelle Davidson's murder. Camera footage from a Salt Lake City shelter showed him in the background, 3 days before a victim was found in that city. The evidence connected him to murder after murder. And then, there was the victim they'd rescued from the meatpacking plant. Her name was Jennifer Hayes, 27 years old, and she'd been held captive for 4 days. Once she was medically stable enough to talk, she gave a statement that made even seasoned detectives sick. Devereaux had told her everything about the original murders in Portland, about the botched execution and coming back to life, about discovering he couldn't feel pain anymore and what that meant for his future victims. He'd described it like he was discussing the weather, casual, factual, completely devoid of emotion. Jennifer said he'd told her he was conducting experiments, testing how far he could push the human body, how much damage it could sustain. All the scientific curiosity of a researcher applied to torture and murder. The inability to feel pain had given him a twisted kind of freedom. He could inflict injury on others without the instinctive empathetic response that stops most people, and he could sustain injury himself without the biological warning system that makes humans cautious. He said he was evolving, Jennifer told Detective Sarah Brennan, who'd flown to Spokane from Portland to assist with the case. He said the execution had burned away his weakness, and now he was something more than human, something better. The psychiatric evaluation conducted after his capture was even more disturbing than the first. Dr. Morrison was brought in again to assess him. Her conclusion: the electrical trauma had caused measurable changes in brain structure. The regions associated with empathy, fear, and emotional regulation showed almost no activity. His prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, had been fundamentally altered by the massive electrical surges. In her report, Dr. Morrison wrote, "Stephen Devereaux is no longer the same individual who was convicted in 2008. The combination of severe neurological damage, pain insensitivity, and what appears to be a complete loss of emotional affect has created what can only be described as a purely predatory intelligence. He understands social rules and legal consequences on an intellectual level, but has no emotional connection to them. He is aware that killing is wrong, but this knowledge has no bearing on his behavior because the emotional and biological deterrents that govern human conduct have been destroyed." The legal proceedings began in July 2010. This time, there would be no execution. The state of Oregon declined to pursue the death penalty again. The previous attempt had created this monster, and nobody wanted to risk what a second failed execution might produce. Washington State, where the final crimes had occurred, followed suit. Instead, Stephen Devereaux was charged with 14 counts of first-degree murder committed after his escape. The full count had risen as cold cases were connected to him. 1 count of murder of a peace officer, guard Thomas Pax, multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and escape from custody. The trial was a media circus. True crime writers filled the courtroom. Victims' families from multiple states attended. Security was unprecedented. Armed guards everywhere, metal detectors, restricted access. Devereaux sat through it all with that same flat effect. Never showed emotion, even when graphic crime scene photos were displayed. Even when Jennifer Hayes testified about her captivity, describing in detail the things he'd done and said, he just watched, like he was observing something mildly interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to him. The verdict came back in September 2010, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing brought families from across the country, 21 victims, 21 families destroyed, 22 if you counted guard Pax. Rachel Morrison's mother, now 68 years old, stood up during victim impact statements. She looked directly at Devereaux and said, "You took my daughter once. Then you escaped and took 13 more daughters from other mothers. I pray every night that whatever hell you end up in, you finally learn what pain feels like." Devereaux was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, 21 consecutive life sentences to be served at ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It's where they send the absolute worst of the worst, prisoners so dangerous they can never be allowed contact with other inmates or the outside world. He was transported there in October 2010, under escort by federal marshals, in restraints the entire journey. He's been there ever since, in 23-hour solitary confinement, monitored constantly, every movement tracked. The FBI's final report on the Devereaux case ran to over 3,000 pages. It detailed every aspect of his crimes, original and post-escape. It analyzed the execution failure from every angle: equipment malfunction, procedural error, or something genuinely anomalous about Devereaux's physiology that made him resistant to electrocution. The medical examination was particularly thorough. Devereaux's autopsy, when he eventually dies of natural causes, has been pre-authorized for extensive study. Scientists want to understand what happened to his body, how the electrical current affected his neural pathways, what made him survive when by all rights he should have died. But that's future research. For now, Stephen Devereaux sits in a concrete box in Colorado, alone with whatever thoughts move through his damaged brain. No pain to feel, no empathy to experience, no fear of consequences, just existence, stretching out toward an eventual natural death that his body once refused to accept. The aftermath of the Stephen Devereaux case rippled out in ways nobody expected. Oregon placed a moratorium on executions in 2011, citing the Devereaux case as a primary reason. The debate over capital punishment gained new fuel. What do you do when an execution fails so catastrophically that it creates something worse than the original killer? Several states revised their execution protocols. Nevada and Tennessee, both of which still used electrocution as an option, switched exclusively to lethal injection. The electric chair, already controversial, became effectively obsolete across the country. By 2015, only 3 states still offered electrocution as a method, and even then, only as an alternative if lethal injection drugs were unavailable. But the changes went deeper than just execution methods. The Devereaux case forced a national conversation about what happens when the justice system fails in the most spectacular way possible. Legal scholars wrote papers about it. Medical ethicists debated the implications. Constitutional lawyers argued about whether surviving an execution meant the sentence had been carried out, or whether it constituted cruel and unusual punishment to try again. Judge Margaret Thornton, who'd sentenced Devereaux to death the first time, gave a speech at a legal conference in 2012. She talked about the weight of sending someone to their death, about how she'd agonized over that decision even though the evidence was overwhelming. And then she talked about what it felt like to learn that her sentence had created something worse. "I sentenced a serial killer to death," she said, her voice breaking. "And instead, I gave birth to a monster. That's something I'll carry until my own death." The victims' families formed an advocacy group called 21 Voices, dedicated to supporting families of multiple victim crimes and pushing for better victim services. Rachel Morrison's sister, Catherine, leads it now. She was 35 when her sister was murdered, and she's spent the last 17 years making sure other families don't feel as lost and abandoned as she did. 21 Voices provides counseling referrals, helps navigate the legal system, connects families with support groups, and lobbies for legislation protecting victims' rights. Catherine gave an interview in 2020 on the 15th anniversary of Rachel's death. She said something that stuck with a lot of people. "My sister was the first, but she wasn't the last. And every family that came after us had to suffer not just because of what Stephen Devereaux was, but because of what the state accidentally made him become. That's an extra layer of tragedy that shouldn't exist." The 21 Voices organization successfully lobbied for the Victims' Comprehensive Rights Act in Oregon, which guarantees families the right to be informed at every stage of legal proceedings, provides funding for victim support services, and mandates psychological support for families dealing with violent crime. Several other states have adopted similar legislation, using Oregon's law as a model. Detective Sarah Brennan retired from Portland PD in 2015. She was 44 years old, should have had another decade of good work ahead of her, but the Devereaux case took everything she had to give. In her last interview before retiring, she talked about the weight of it all. "I caught him once," she said. "I built the case, I got the evidence, I put him away. And then the system failed, and 13 more people died because he got a second chance. How do you process that? How do you wake up every morning knowing that your victory turned into someone else's nightmare?" Brennan moved to a small town in Northern California after retirement. Last anyone heard, she was working at a community garden and doing volunteer work with at-risk youth. She doesn't do interviews anymore, doesn't talk about the case. People who know her say she just wants to spend whatever years she has left focusing on life instead of death. Teresa Coleman, the woman who survived Devereaux twice, once before his original arrest and again by identifying him in Spokane, moved to a different state under a new identity through the Federal Witness Protection Program. She doesn't do interviews, she's asked for complete privacy, and her location is kept confidential for her own safety and peace of mind. The U.S. Marshals Service confirmed in 2014 that she was doing well, had rebuilt her life, and wanted nothing more to do with the case that nearly destroyed her. But here's something beautiful that came out of that horror. Teresa's bravery in coming forward the second time, despite her fear, inspired the creation of the Coleman Foundation, a nonprofit that helps homeless individuals who've witnessed crimes to come forward safely. The foundation provides temporary housing, legal assistance, and protection for witnesses who might otherwise be too vulnerable to cooperate with law enforcement. Since its founding in 2011, it's helped solve over 200 violent crimes by ensuring witnesses have support and safety. Jennifer Hayes, the last victim who survived, struggled with severe PTSD for years. She spent 2 years in intensive therapy, dealing with nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. There were times, she said in interviews, when she wasn't sure she wanted to keep living with the memories of those 4 days in that meatpacking plant. But somewhere around 2013, something shifted. Jennifer started volunteering at a crisis center in Spokane, just a few hours a week at first, answering phones, doing administrative work. Then she started training to become a peer counselor. By 2016, she'd gone back to school, gotten her master's degree in clinical psychology, and started specializing in trauma recovery. Today, Jennifer Hayes runs a trauma therapy practice that specifically works with survivors of violent crime. She's written 2 books about resilience and recovery. She gives talks at conferences, and she says that while she'll never be grateful for what Devereaux did to her, she's learned to transform that horror into purpose. "He wanted to break me," she said in a 2023 interview. "He wanted to prove that humans are just meat and biology, that we can be destroyed. But I'm still here. I'm still human. I still love and hope and dream. And every person I help heal is proof that he was wrong about everything." The journals, according to prison psychologists who've reviewed them, show no remorse, no emotional evolution, no sign that age or isolation has changed him fundamentally. He writes about his crimes with clinical detachment, treating them as data points in some grand experiment only he understands. He's written extensively about pain, or rather, the absence of it, and what it means to exist without one of humanity's most fundamental experiences. In 2022, a journalist requested an interview with Devereaux through proper channels. The request was denied by prison officials, but Devereaux sent back a written response that was reviewed and released to the journalist. In it, he wrote, "Pain is the leash that keeps humanity docile. Remove it, and you see what people really are beneath the conditioning. I am simply the logical conclusion of human nature without biological constraints. Everyone else is still pretending." That's who Stephen Devereaux is now. That's who the botched execution created. A man who sees his lack of pain, his absence of empathy, his neurological damage not as deficits, but as evolution. A monster who thinks he's become something superior by losing the very things that make us human. 21 lives stolen. 21 voices silenced. We remember them. We honor them. And we make damn sure their killer never sees freedom again, in this life or the next. Rachel Morrison, Sarah Chen, Jessica Hartley, Melissa Rodriguez, Nicole Torres, Amanda Price, Thomas Pax, Marcus Webb, Michelle Davidson, Jennifer Reyes, Catherine Sullivan, Linda Park, Christina Morales, Rebecca Chen, Ashley Johnson, Maria Santos, Elizabeth Wong, Samantha Lee, Patricia Rivera, Diana Nguyen, and Jennifer Hayes, who survived to tell their stories and transform trauma into hope. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their lives mattered. and the monster who took them from this world sits alone in the dark, where he belongs, until whatever cruel biology kept him alive finally fails and grants him the death he should have received on December 15th, 2008. The case of Stephen Devereaux remains, to this day, the only documented instance of a death row inmate surviving their execution and subsequently committing additional murders. It's a case that forced America to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, about the death penalty, about what happens when our systems fail in the most catastrophic ways possible. And it's a reminder that sometimes the worst monsters aren't born. Sometimes we create them ourselves with the best intentions and the worst possible luck.